Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Obinna was born behind the broken gates of Ajigunal, where life bled slowly into survival, and every day felt like the echo of the last. The streets pulsed with chaos. Vendors shouting over one another, boys chasing balls made of bundled rags, Danfo buses coughing smoke into the thick Lagos air. But amid the whirlwind of noise and motion, there was always that quiet corner of the street where a small boy, skin as dark as rain-soaked soil and eyes far older than his age, rummaged through the refuse pile beside Madame Muj's buka. People often saw him digging through the trash with an intensity that seemed misplaced, almost desperate, like he believed gold hid in the belly of broken blenders and rusted bicycle chains. Some whispered that he was not normal, that something inside his head wasn't wired properly. But he never answered them. He never needed to. There was something about Obinna, an air, a quietness, a constant buzz in his fingers, that made it seem as though he was listening to a voice no one else could hear. And in that chaotic, forgotten part of the city, he became a fixture no one fully understood, yet everyone recognized. The boy with scraps in his hands and silence in his soul. He lived with his parents in a one-room makeshift shack squeezed between a condemned building and an open drainage canal that smelt worse than death itself when the rains came. Their room was made of plywood walls, patched in places with old tarpaulin and political posters from 3 elections ago. The ceiling sagged in the middle, swollen with the weight of water from the last storm, and the floor was a cracked patchwork of cement and mud. Yet despite the bleakness, Obinna never complained. His mother, Mama Esther, sold roasted plantain by the roadside, her hands always charred and her eyes tired, while his father, Papa John, did odd jobs at construction sites but drank away most of what he earned. Obinna had known hunger so intimately that he no longer noticed when his stomach curled in protest. Still, every evening, while his parents argued quietly over money and dreams that had long dried up, Obinna sat cross-legged by the window, his workshop, sorting through his collection of bottle caps, wires, broken torchlights, and cracked phone screens. He didn't know why he was drawn to them. He just was. And as he turned those pieces over in his hand, night after night, he imagined how they might speak, light up, move, come alive. He imagined a world where machines didn't need perfection to function, where broken things still had purpose. In the silence of that dark room, with only the hum of mosquitoes and the flicker of a dying candle, Obinna dreamed wide awake. School was never a place of comfort for him. Government secondary school, located on a dusty road lined with pot-bellied electric poles and cracked walls scribbled with graffiti, was a noisy mess of frustrated teachers and restless students. Obinna often sat in the back row, silent, shrinking, with his uniform 2 sizes too big and his slippers patched with electric tape. His classmates mocked him without mercy, especially when he brought parts of his strange creations to school. They called him Transformer Boy or Scrap Brain, laughed when he pulled out wires from his pockets during break time, and sometimes hid his books or poured water into his bag. But Obinna never lashed out. He simply kept his distance, eyes always fixed on the chalkboard, or more often, on the cracks running through the ceiling like broken circuits waiting to be repaired. The only person who ever spoke to him with softness was Mr. Sewell, the school's ICT teacher, whose thin spectacles sat always at the tip of his nose and whose voice was calm even when every other teacher shouted. Sewell saw something in Obinna, something even Obinna hadn't yet seen in himself. He once told him, in a rare private moment, "You don't belong to this place, boy. Your mind's not from here. And that's a good thing." It was the first time someone acknowledged that Obinna's silence had meaning, that his obsession with discarded electronics wasn't just madness, but maybe, just maybe, a kind of brilliance waiting to take shape. Still, brilliance doesn't feed you an Ajigunal, and dreams alone won't stop your belly from groaning. That truth settled hard one rainy night, the kind of rain that beat the roofs like a mob owed money. Lightning cracked above their home like God himself had snapped a cable loose. Obinna sat by the window as always, water dripping onto his exposed feet, his hand holding a stripped wire and a switch he'd taken from a discarded kettle. He didn't move when the lights blinked off, or when thunder roared through the city like a wounded beast. He just kept working, twisting wire into wire, until something clicked. A small fan, powered by nothing but a potato and a hacked phone battery, began to spin. It spun slowly at first, whining like a tired baby, then picked up speed. It was the first thing he'd built that worked entirely on his own, and for a moment, in that broken house soaked by the storm, Obinna smiled. Not because it was perfect, not because it was powerful, but because something he imagined had finally come alive in his hands. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't know that the world he would change had just taken its first breath. All he knew in that moment was that he had built something from nothing, and that meant everything. The first time Obinna saw the inside of a television was purely accidental. He'd been walking home from school, his slippers flapping against the gritty roadside, when he noticed an elderly man tossing broken appliances out of his compound near Mile 2. Obinna watched as the man flung an old CRT television over the low fence, and it landed with a satisfying crunch, the screen cracking into a spiderweb. Most people would have passed it by, but Obinna stood there for nearly a minute, staring. Something in his chest tightened, like recognition. He waited until the man disappeared into the house, then crept closer, heart pounding, and carefully lifted the shattered shell into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, covered in dust and the faint smell of burnt wires, but he carried it home like a sacred object. He didn't greet his mother when he walked in. He didn't even sit. He dropped to his knees on the cold cement floor, found his screwdriver from the metal tin under the bed, and began unscrewing its secrets. It took hours. Every nut and bolt came off slowly, like peeling back the layers of a stubborn onion. He marveled at the coils, the green boards dotted with silver, the maze of wires woven like the thoughts in his head. He didn't know the names of the parts, but he understood how they talked to each other. It was like music, no lyrics, no rhythm, but a kind of coded harmony that made perfect sense to him and only him. In the following weeks, Obinna's room transformed. It no longer resembled a place where people slept. It looked like a scrapyard laboratory. Every available space, beneath the wooden bed on the window ledge, even nailed to the plywood wall, held remnants of discarded machines. Burnt irons, old fan motors, cracked radios. To his parents, it looked like madness growing roots. His father would mutter in Igbo, shaking his head, "You no go read book, you day play with nonsense." His mother, though exhausted, never raised her voice. She simply sighed each time she stepped over wires on the way to make pap in the morning. But Obinna knew better than to explain himself. Words felt like stones in his mouth, always heavy, always the wrong shape. Instead, he let his hands do the speaking. He fixed the neighbor's flashlight without asking. He made a working bulb out of discarded Christmas lights, and powered it using a battery he patched together from old remote controls. These weren't miracles. They were possibilities that only needed someone curious enough to try. Still, even with all he could build, there was a limit to what his environment allowed. His ideas were too big for the narrow walls he lived between, and he knew that no matter how bright a fire was, if you placed it in a box with no oxygen, it would die quietly without a sound. The classroom became another kind of prison. Lessons felt like chains, rigid formulas, rote recitations, and dusty chalkboards that had forgotten how to inspire. The teachers rarely smiled, their words worn down by years of unpaid salaries and overcrowded classrooms. Obinna attended, not because he believed in the school system, but because there was no other option. He sat at the back, drawing circuit diagrams in the margins of his notebooks, while the other students laughed at stale jokes or traded insults like coins. He had one friend, a boy named Jide, who stammered and loved to draw comics of superheroes in Lagos traffic. They rarely spoke, but there was a quiet bond between them. Two boys who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Then, one dry Thursday morning, everything changed. The principal, stern-faced and always smelling of menthol bomb, announced a regional tech competition to be held in Victoria Island. Private schools, international exposure, real investors. The room stirred with excitement. Obinna felt something shift in his chest, a pulse, a nudge from something bigger than him. But when Mr. Sewell raised his hand and nominated Obinna, the air turned cold. The class laughed. A voice shouted, "He go with scrap? Make he no disgrace us oh." The laughter echoed. Obinna didn't flinch. He looked at the floor, then at the windows, as if watching something far beyond the walls. His name was written down anyway. That night, for the first time in a long while, he didn't touch any wires. He sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, wondering if fate was finally knocking, or if it was just another cruel joke in disguise. The days that followed moved like molasses. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dripping slowly into the next. Obinna could barely sleep. He spent most of the night staring at parts, sketching ideas in the corners of used notebooks, tearing them out, and starting again. His tiny workspace looked more chaotic than usual. Wires spilling like noodles off the table, capacitors rolling into corners, batteries stacked beside salt containers. He knew he couldn't just build anything. It had to matter. It had to speak. It had to solve something real. His thoughts returned again and again to his mother, how she coughed each time smoke from the firewood stove filled their small room. How once, their kerosene lamp tipped over and almost set the curtain ablaze. That's when the idea came, not like a lightning bolt, but a whisper in the dark. What if he could build a machine that could detect danger? Heat, fire, movement. What if it could respond, without internet, without electricity, just react and protect, using only the logic of levers, springs, and current? It wouldn't look fancy, but it would function. That was what mattered. The next morning, Obinna got to work. He didn't tell anyone, not his parents, not Mr. Sewell, not even Jide. He began gathering parts, pulling pieces from radios, alarms, even the melted remnants of a toaster. He worked in silence, hands moving with the urgency of someone who'd finally heard his calling loud and clear. For the first time, his inventions weren't just about curiosity. They were about purpose. Cert. The sun had just begun to rise when Obinna slipped out of the house, a rucksack on his back and silence in his mouth. The world was still wet with sleep, the streets of Ajagunal half awake, littered with the shadows of early hawkers and the remains of yesterday's noise. He walked past the rusted gate that never locked, past the walls painted with political promises, and turned toward the metal scrap yard behind the railway tracks. That was where he hunted. The man who ran the place, known simply as Baba Two-Tooth, allowed him in exchange for small errands, sweeping, fetching water, sometimes standing guard when the police did unannounced raids. Obinna didn't mind. In that graveyard of old fridges, microwaves, and forgotten air conditioners, he found treasure. He picked with intention, not by age, not by color, but by potential. Every wire, every circuit, every hinge spoke to him like puzzle pieces looking for their match. That morning, he found what he needed: a smoke detector with a cracked shell, a small burnt speaker, the metal frame of a broken alarm clock, and a half-melted power bank. He packed them into his bag and disappeared before the sky fully woke. His hands were trembling, not with fear, but with urgency. He didn't have the luxury of second chances. He had 8 days to build something that could outshine the shine of those who had never known lack. And all he had were scraps and grit. Back home, his room became something between a laboratory and a battlefield. The walls echoed with the soft hum of soldered wires, the sharp taps of a makeshift hammer, the faint buzz of circuits coming back to life. He used a dead DVD player as a base, stripped the internal components, and reshaped the casing with a heated spoon. He created a shell that could house the sensors. For a face, he painted a rough smile and 2 dot eyes on a piece of cardboard, partly to humanize the machine, partly to keep himself from feeling too alone. It was quiet work, requiring patience and improvisation, especially when the only light came from a flickering rechargeable lamp that coughed with every voltage drop. His mother didn't disturb him. She had learned not to ask questions, only to leave food by the door. His father hardly noticed. He'd stopped paying attention since the second failed job offer. And so Obinna worked, often forgetting the hours, barely aware of his aching back or the numbness in his knees. He focused on building not just a device, but a voice, something that could speak where he had always remained silent. It would respond to changes in heat, sound an alarm in rising temperatures, detect movement in darkness, and do it all without depending on light or modern tech. Just pulleys, sensors, resistors, and thought. By the 5th night, he could hear it breathe, a low mechanical buzz like a heartbeat beneath a metal chest. The closer the competition day came, the more the weight in his chest grew. Doubt crept in, not like a storm, but like a slow leak, quiet and cold. He would sit and stare at the device, now shaped and standing on small plastic wheels, wondering if it was enough. He remembered how the principal had looked at him when his name was written down, like someone choosing to lose on purpose. He remembered the laughter of his classmates, the sideways glances, the sharp-edged whispers that followed him down the school corridors. And then he remembered his mother coughing from smoke, the flames that once licked the kitchen curtain before the neighbors rushed in with water, the times he'd prayed for a small warning, just something that could have prevented the scare. That was when the doubt died. This machine, crude as it looked, wasn't meant for applause. It wasn't built for clapping audiences or Instagram videos. It was built for people like his mother, who didn't know what tech meant but knew the sting of fire, the weight of fear, the silence that came after disaster. He named it Okeke, not after anyone famous, but after his late uncle, the quiet man who once built him a wooden bird that flapped its wings when pulled by string. Naming it Okeke felt like passing on a forgotten memory. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't powerful, but it worked. And that was all that mattered. On the morning of the event, Obinna dressed in a borrowed shirt, the collar too wide for his neck, and the sleeves folded twice to hide how they dangled like curtains. His trousers were ironed by his mother at 3 a.m., using a coal iron she borrowed from a neighbor. He didn't complain. He packed Okeke carefully into a cardboard box cushioned with old clothes, and left the house without ceremony. The streets were already alive by then. Lagos never truly slept. Danfo buses sped past with conductors yelling destinations. The air smelled of fried akra and burning diesel. He boarded a rickety bus heading toward Victoria Island, a place that always seemed more like a story than a destination. The other passengers stared at his box, some curious, others indifferent. He sat quietly, hands on his lap, his mind split between fear and hope. Every bump on the road shook the box, but not his resolve. As they crossed the third mainland bridge, he looked out at the water, endless and patient. He thought of everything: his room, the sparks, the whispers, the mocking faces, and Mr. Sewell's soft voice reminding him that not all light comes from bulbs. Some of it comes from inside. He didn't know if he would win. He didn't know if he would even be allowed to present. But he knew this. He had come too far, broken too many odds, and built too much from nothing to back down now. The gate to the venue was taller than any building Obinna had ever stood beside. It gleamed in the morning sun like something from a foreign film, cold steel and polished glass rising from the ground like it had been planted by gods, not men. The security men barely looked at him when he approached, dragging his box of wires and wood, but their expressions shifted the moment they saw his name on the attendance list. He expected them to laugh or scoff, maybe even tell him to stand aside while they searched his contraption, but instead, they waved him in with bored efficiency, barely raising their voices. Inside, the compound felt unreal. White tents stretched across manicured lawns, banners fluttered with words like innovation, technology for tomorrow, and future builders of Africa. He walked past students wearing matching uniforms, shoes that shone like water, and lanyards around their necks that made them look important. They carried tablets. They spoke in polished English. Their laughter sounded rehearsed. He found his table near the back of the hall, tucked between a group of private school boys from Lekki and a girl team from Abuja whose project included a small drone with blinking lights. He didn't unpack Okeke immediately. He sat for a while, letting the buzz of the place wash over him, trying not to drown in the unfamiliar rhythm. It felt like a different planet, one where he didn't belong, one that didn't care how far he had come or how hard he had worked. But even as his stomach twisted, his hands remained steady. Fear lived in his chest, yes, but determination had rented space there first. One of the judges came around before the presentations began. A woman with sharp glasses, lips painted like hibiscus, and a clipboard she scribbled on without looking up. When she stopped at Obinna's table, her eyes dropped to the cardboard box at his feet, then slowly rose to meet his. She said nothing, just nodded once and moved on. That was all. No esmail, no curiosity, no inquiriment. Obinna exhaled slowly, as though her silence had stolen the little air left in the room. He looked around. Other students were now assembling their projects. One table featured a smart home model complete with voice-activated doors. Another showcased an irrigation system that used weather sensors. Every device shown glowed, beeped, or blinked. Obinna opened his box and began to piece together Okeke quietly, as if afraid to disturb the air. He tightened the bolts, adjusted the wiring, realigned the sensors, and tested the speaker with a soft tap. The machine coughed, then whirred to life with a low buzz. He smiled faintly. The others didn't notice him. They were too busy posing for photos, calling teachers over to admire their polished setups. When the announcer finally took the stage, a man in a navy suit with a voice that echoed through the speakers like thunder, Obinna didn't hear the words. He only heard his own heartbeat and the tiny hum from Okeke's internal circuit. He whispered once to the machine, as if to an old friend, and sat up straight. He didn't expect applause. He didn't expect respect. But he was ready to speak through the only voice he trusted, his invention. When his name was finally called, it sounded like a joke. The microphone crackled slightly, and there was a small pause, as though the announcer was unsure if it was worth saying at all. Obinna John, from Ajigunle Secondary School. A few heads turned. Some snickered. One boy leaned to whisper to another, and they both laughed. Obinna stood. He lifted Okeke with both arms and stepped toward the stage. The room wasn't silent, but it changed. Conversations softened. Phones lowered. He climbed the stairs carefully, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished wood. The projector screen behind him flickered with his name in block letters, nothing fancy. Nulagu. No school anthem. Just a name, bare, simple, misplaced among the glitter. He placed Okeke gently on the table set before him, adjusted the mic, and cleared his throat. His voice came out small at first, but firm. Good morning. My name is Obinna, and this is Okeke. I built it for people like my mother, who cook with firewood, who have no electricity, who need to be warned before a disaster happens. The room stilled. He explained how it worked, how it sensed heat using basic analog sensors, how it could signal danger even without power, how it could make noise loud enough to wake a sleeping child or a tired woman. He didn't use big words. He didn't mention AI or smart chips. He spoke like he was speaking to his neighbors, and maybe that's why it landed. He flipped the switch. Okeke blinked. A soft voice came from the speaker. Heat detected. Please check your environment. That was all. But the silence that followed was the loudest thing Obinna had ever heard. No one clapped at first. Not out of rudeness, but because they didn't know how. What they'd just witnessed didn't sparkle. It didn't fly. It didn't come with colored lights or futuristic touchscreens. It was made of scraps. Wires that once lived inside burnt radios. Screws borrowed from broken fans. A voice chip recycled from an old talking toy. And yet, somehow it worked. It breathed purpose. The judges looked at one another. The man in glasses scribbled something. The woman with the hibiscus lipstick leaned forward and asked Obinna one question. How did you learn to build this? He replied simply, I taught myself. That was all. No drama. No tears. Just truth, plain and strong. The applause came slowly, then gathered strength, like rain that begins with a few drops before turning into a downpour. Not everyone clapped. But the ones who did, judges, teachers, even one of the students from the Abuja team, clapped like they'd seen something they hadn't expected to find in a hall made for polished perfection. Obinna bowed slightly, picked up Okeke, and stepped down from the stage the same way he had gone up. Carefully, quietly, humbly. But inside him, something had shifted. A door had opened. And though he had no idea what lay behind it, he knew it led somewhere far beyond the walls of that room. He had barely returned to his seat when two men in dark suits approached the row where he sat. They didn't speak to the teachers or the other students. Their eyes were locked on Obinna. One of them, a light-skinned man with gray around his temples and a neat foreign accent, leaned in and asked if he could have a moment. Obinna looked at Mr. Sewell, who nodded slowly, then followed them through a side door that led to a quieter hallway. The air in there felt different, cleaner, colder, untouched by noise. The taller man introduced himself as Dr. Harrison, an engineer with a Dutch tech firm, focused on sustainable devices for low-income environments. The other, a black woman with a British accent and curious eyes, introduced herself as Elise, a research lead on humanitarian technologies. They had seen many inventions, they said, but none that made them stop in their tracks like Obinna's. They weren't praising the design, it wasn't sleek. They weren't impressed by aesthetics, it had none. What struck them was its honesty. The machine didn't pretend. It wasn't trying to be something it wasn't. It was built with limited tools to solve a real problem that millions of people quietly lived with. Elise asked again how he learned to build something so complex. He answered again, I watch things. I touch them. I break them and put them back. They asked if he would be interested in continuing this kind of work outside Nigeria, somewhere with better resources. He didn't speak for a long time. The hallway hummed. And then softly he said, If I go, can I come back? The days after the competition blurred into a kind of dream Obinna wasn't sure he was awake in. The tech firm handled everything, calls, papers, approvals. His passport, which he had never thought he'd need, was processed through a special channel. His parents were told through a visit from Mr. Sewell, who tried his best to explain everything in words simple enough for their fear to digest. Mama Esther wept without sound, pressing her hands to her chest as if holding her son's presence inside her ribs. Papa John said little, only nodding when told that Obinna would be leaving the country for school, for training, for something big. On the morning he left, there was no ceremony, no party, no music, just a hug from his mother so tight it almost crushed him, and a look from his father that said, I don't understand you, but I'm watching. The airport felt unreal. Lights too bright, floors too clean, announcements echoing in an accent that bounced off the high ceiling like a song he hadn't learned yet. He boarded the plane with his box in hand, Okeke packed carefully, wrapped in his mother's head tie. The stewardess tried to take the box from him for storage. He refused. The flight was long, strange, like floating through a dream stitched together by clouds. When they landed, he stepped into a city where the air didn't smell of heat or sweat or fish oil, but of glass, steel, and machines that whispered instead of shouted. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't proud. He was simply ready. Obinna found himself in a world so far removed from Ajigunle, it might as well have existed in a different lifetime. The Netherlands was quiet in ways that felt almost haunted. The streets were neat, the buildings obedient, and the people walked like they were sure of everything. He was enrolled in a program that trained gifted minds from underprivileged backgrounds, and for the first time in his life, he had access to real tools. Real soldering kits. Real labs. Instructors who asked him why, not how, and didn't treat his curiosity like a problem. He spoke less than the others, not because he didn't understand, but because he was still learning how to carry his thoughts without wrapping them in fear. His accent stood out. So did his silence. But his ideas, once shared, gripped attention like magnets. He worked on more refined versions of Okeke, each one smaller, smarter, faster. But he never chased perfection, only function. Even in that bright, clean world, his heart still beat to the rhythm of his mother's cooking fire, the leak in their roof, the hum of broken radios on Lagos afternoons. Sometimes, at night, he would lie awake and imagine the sound of rain pounding on their corrugated roof. He missed the chaos. He missed the noise. But mostly he missed the smallness of things. How every little success back home had felt like a revolution. In this new world, even the grandest achievements came with polite claps and quiet smiles. He wanted more than applause. He wanted meaning. The moment of recognition didn't come with cameras or confetti. It came during an exhibition at a humanitarian summit in Geneva, where Obinna presented a refined version of Okeke, now embedded in a low-cost fire safety system for rural homes. The prototype was made from biodegradable materials and cost less than the average family's meal. It could be installed without tools, powered itself, and spoke 5 local languages. People listened. Investors paused. A professor from MIT called it elegantly brutal. A machine that didn't pretend to be beautiful, but insisted on being necessary. But it wasn't the applause that made it real for Obinna. It was the old woman who approached him afterward, through an interpreter, and said her sister had once died in a hut fire in Sierra Leone because no one smelled the smoke in time. She held the device and said, "If we had this, she might still be here." That night, Obinna didn't sleep. He sat by the hotel window, box on his lap, hands on the rough casing of Okeke like it was still the first one. He whispered into the dark, not to be heard, but to release something stuck in his throat since the day he first held wire in his palm. He knew then that no matter where this road led, he would walk it with the same dust on his feet from Ajigunle. Because brilliance meant nothing if it didn't serve those who couldn't ask for help. And Okeke, still ugly, still simple, was the loudest way he knew how to answer. The return was quieter than anyone imagined it would be. There was no crowd at the airport, no music, no banner or brass band waiting to declare him a hero. Lagos welcomed him like it always had, hot, noisy, impatient. The taxi driver didn't recognize him. He spoke to Obinna like any other tired passenger, haggling over fare, groaning about traffic, and complaining about the government in the same breath. Obinna just nodded, gazing out the window as they drove past places that had once looked enormous to him, now smaller, more weathered, but still breathing with life. Ajigunle hadn't changed much. The roads were still stubborn with potholes, the power still blinked like a weak eye, and the faces on the street wore the same mix of resilience and exhaustion. But something had shifted inside him. He didn't walk any taller. He didn't try to act different. If anything, he walked more slowly, soaking in each voice, each smell, each corner that had once felt like a prison but now whispered to him like a lover reminding him of his roots. He made his way home carrying nothing but a worn backpack and the latest version of Okeke cradled like a child in his arms. The house was still there, leaning slightly to the left, patched with new zinc sheets. His mother stood outside, her hands still soaked in palm oil, staring at him like he'd stepped out of a story. She didn't speak. She just dropped the bowl she was holding and wrapped her arms around him, so tight it pulled him back to the days when nothing in the world made sense except her embrace. Inside the house, it was as though time had refused to pass. The same small table. The same smell of wood smoke clinging to the curtains. Even the flickering bulb that buzzed above their heads still hung from the same crooked wire. Yet, Obinna noticed everything now with a kind of reverence. Every scar on the wall, every corner of peeling paint, every creak of the bed frame, each detail was a memory, not a flaw. He sat with his mother for hours, listening to stories he already knew but hadn't heard in years. His father came in later, older somehow, shoulders stooped a little more, but when he saw Obinna, his lips tightened and his eyes flicked downward. He didn't speak either. Instead, he simply walked to the bench, sat down, and reached for his cigarette without lighting it. Obinna understood. Some silences were thicker than words. That night, he placed Okeke on the floor beside his mattress, connected it to the socket through an adapter, and watched it blink once, then power down softly. He didn't bring it out to impress anyone. He didn't even talk about the interviews, the projects, the money people had started offering him. He wasn't here to boast. He was here to rest, to remember, to reconnect. In the early hours of the morning, he stepped outside, bare-chested, feet pressed to the wet concrete, and stared up at a sky so familiar it felt like it had been waiting for him. He didn't cry, but the wind that passed through him carried the weight of someone who had seen too much too soon and still managed to carry it all home. Word spread faster than he expected, even though he told no one. The next day, 2 boys from the street knocked on his door holding a broken fan and asking if he could teach them to fix it. He wanted to say no at first. He was tired. He had plans. But then he remembered himself at their age, standing with a piece of wire and no one to ask what to do with it. So he invited them in. No lectures, no sermons, no camera crew. Just 3 boys, a fan, and a cluttered floor filled with screws and questions. The days stretched like that. Someone brought a broken radio. Another brought an electric kettle with a fried circuit. A girl from down the road, who used to mock him, now sat quietly while he explained how batteries worked. The house became a sort of quiet center, small, messy, but alive. He didn't call it a training. He didn't call it a program. He just opened his door and let those who were curious come in. It was enough. Mr. Sewell visited once, bringing along a small envelope filled with newspaper clippings. Apparently, Obinna's name had started appearing in articles. The boy who built the future from junk. But Obinna didn't read them. Fame, he understood now, was a wind that could lift or destroy depending on what direction it blew from. He wasn't chasing noise. He was chasing clarity. And every time one of the children figured out how to fix something, that was enough applause for him. Late one evening, as the city groaned into night and generators buzzed like tired insects, Obinna sat by the edge of the gutter behind the house. Okeke rested beside him, quiet, blinking occasionally like it had its own thoughts. He had been invited to speak in South Africa. Another summit. Another stage. All expenses paid. A chance to showcase the new line of devices he had been working on, low-cost, analog systems for fire, flood, and theft detection in vulnerable neighborhoods. He had accepted, but not immediately. He had paused for 2 days before replying to the email. Not because he doubted himself, but because each journey now cost him more emotionally than it used to. Leaving this place, even briefly, was like cutting a thread he had spent years tying. But still he would go. He would speak. He would return. Always return. Because he owed it to the streets that taught him to see value in rust. To the silence that once filled his room and birthed invention. And to the boy he once was, who built a voice out of discarded parts. He looked at Okeke now, no longer ugly, no longer doubted. And as it blinked once more in the dark, he whispered not with sadness but with a quiet kind of triumph, "We did good." And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe it. Sometimes, your background will try to convince you that you're not enough. People may laugh at your dreams, call your efforts foolish, or ignore your small beginnings. But never forget this: where you start doesn't define where you'll finish. Keep building, keep learning, and keep showing up. Even if the world isn't watching yet, your time will come. Just like Obinna, your gift will make room for you if you don't give up. May your hands never be empty of purpose. May your ideas find light, even in dark places. May every closed door open when your name is mentioned for good. May you rise from the background into the spotlight without losing your humility. May your gift speak louder than your circumstances. May helpers locate you before your strength runs out. And when your breakthrough comes, may it never turn your heart away from where you started. In places you've been forgotten, may grace cause you to be remembered. In Jesus' name, it is so. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.